The investments that they're making in trying to create more user-friendly products that are more aligned with user needs, it's kind of failing because of their day-to-day business practices. And I think in a lot of markets, it's really not about competing on having more and more features. It's competing on, for example, the user experience. So I think it's become a lot more about kind of better execution. For example, I guess when the iPhone was first introduced, it wasn't necessarily really competing on features. I think it missed video chat. It didn't have the ability to send photo images. It really didn't compete on a feature set. It competed on the user experience. Yet when we talk to kind of clients, we see that doing user research, building on this kind of user experience part is quite often dismissed because it's either too expensive or not worthwhile. So I want to talk about these three parts of user experience. Process that you take when you're doing user research that you can apply to kind of better leverage getting impact. So I'll talk about how you can put the kind of hypothesis, the really questions that you have more front and center. I'll talk about what methods you can use to get the most out of your user research. And I'll talk about how to report it in such a way that it really engages with the stakeholders. Sorry. And then finally I'll talk about tricks you can employ to get more impact. So, hypothesis first. So the project that I'm working on for a few months ago is a project that was about unemployment insurance. So this is a client of us that provides people information if they want to get an unemployment insurance. And these are people that are kind of incapable of working through some kind of disability. And we start the process with kind of this short brief. So in this case, they were building a website that would provide users with information about whether they would qualify for a certain unemployment benefit. And so that's the feature. The users that they were targeting were people who had some kind of disability that prevented them from working at all, or at least prevented them from maybe working like half-time, for example. And the business value that they try to get out of this project is to reduce the amount of calls that they would get. So, the help desk calls that they would get for people trying to figure out the rules. And for users, I guess it's the other side, like not having to call the help desk is usually quite nice. And the fact that they could actually consume the information on their own pace. And so we know that's true because when we actually see that people were able to find information, so that was kind of the validation. If people are able to find the information that they were looking for to see whether they would or wouldn't get this benefit, then we know we've achieved this kind of business goal. So what we did is we first focused on what are the kind of most dangerous, most risky parts of this project. What does the UX really needs to offer? So first of all, it needs to offer them assurance, right? People who have this kind of disability, what actually happens if I don't qualify? Like, do I go into this kind of dead end where I don't know what's happening, or are there kind of other models in place? And then guidance. So these kind of rules around unemployment benefits, they're quite complex. And the idea is, does the system give enough kind of confidence that they can actually find it on that website? And then the last part is task success. Could they just actually find it when they were on that page? So we did this technique that was actually quite simple. We went to people's homes and we just kind of talked to them. We talked to them about what kind of got them in the situation that they are unemployed. because that's kind of good for understanding the background, where they're coming from. And then we talked about how this website was informing them about what benefits they would or wouldn't get. And so we chose this method to just go to their home, because it could help us get started right away. Especially when you're, for example, working with an audience that is in some way more restricted in, coming to your lab or coming to you in any way. Actually going to them is probably just the easiest kind of alternative that you can take. So we did this, and what we found out after talking to, I think, about like 20 different people that we kind of knew through our social channels that had some form of disability that prevented them from working. We found these three things which really formed the way that the website was structured. So what we found is that there's kind of three situations that people can be in. It's in the situation where they really want to work, and although they have some disability, they actually can work. So maybe not full-time, but half-time or whatever. There's people who want to work, but simply can't because of their disability. And then there's people who really don't want to work and also can't because of their disability. And what we saw is that the website really focused in on this first scenario. For the agency, their main kind of key performance indicator was that they were getting more people back to work. And therefore, the website was completely aimed around this first scenario. Now, even though a lot of people with this disability couldn't just work, they just couldn't. So all of the people that fitted in kind of scenario 2 and 3 would be kind of left in the dark as to what would happen. And they didn't know at the end of the month whether they would receive that benefit or not. So this created a lot of kind of frustration and doubt with the system. And in the end, it meant that it kind of failed the business goal. We found kind of in this short period of time, I think we spent about 1.5 weeks talking to people, that the business goal is, right, to reduce the calls. And although the other business goal that they obviously have is to get more people from unemployment to employment, that was maybe kind of raised a little bit. They would get a lot more calls from people who just didn't understand the information because it was not, their use case wasn't considered. And then obviously the user goal of actually being able to figure out whether they would get the right information, whether they would get that benefit, was completely lost. So this is kind of one of those projects where I worked on where you could actually see neither the business goal or the user goal is achieved, simply because the focus is on a different metric, which kind of skews the website. So the first part that I want to talk about is kind of choosing the method. Especially when you're doing guerrilla user research, you have to be kind of really scruffy and try to find a method that works. You're often bound by a lot of restrictions, right? Like from time to budget, and to be honest, even if there is any budget for UX, I encounter a lot of projects where there's maybe a little bit of budget assigned for design, but then UX is still kind of a difficult thing. So we have to be really creative with the methods we choose. And I work with quite a few clients where we coin this idea of user experience, and we let it sit there for a while. After a while, they come back to me and they say, I need a usability test, or I need a survey. And to be honest, that's kind of like going to the dentist and saying, I need a cap on my teeth number 16. It's assuming, right, that you've kind of missed this part of the discussion where they decided what the problem was that they needed to fix, and they decided which solution best fits that problem. And by working on that kind of hypothesis first, so that kind of model that I showed, it helps them to first kind of understand and capture what the actual goal is, what they're actually trying to figure out. As that's usually much more informative than just deciding that you want to do a usability test. So in explaining to clients kind of what kind of methods you can use to do user research, and especially which ones will generate the most value for the particular question that they have. The first thing we ask is, are they kind of trying to understand people's beliefs and understanding of a concept? And this is kind of what they say, right? Is that what we're trying to understand? So kind of this attitudinal part. Or are we trying to understand what people actually do on the website or the product or within a given certain context? So that's really the behavioral part. And then we ask, are you trying to find out kind of the rationale, like why something is happening, why something is a problem, why something is important? Or are you trying to find out how important is it? Is it much more important than something else? Or how many people are suffering from this problem? So really those kind of two edges. And then I'm always a little bit cautious with quantitative methods. So the how many question, I think a lot of people just like data. They like seeing numbers. It makes them feel like they're confident in that choice because there is a numerical value to it. But I think more often than not, it doesn't actually answer that question. It just takes away kind of some discussion that you might have in the larger group. So I'm always a little bit careful with that. And so I'm wondering if we talk about kind of these qualitative methods, say like usability testing or doing interviews or really just talking to users. Kind of by a show of hands, how many people here have kind of talked to their end users in their projects? Okay, all right. And then when it comes to quantitative methods like surveys or web analytics, by show of hands, how many people have done that? Okay, all right. So I'll talk about a few methods then, kind of in light of this. So I want to focus in on, I guess, on 3 of them that I kind of commonly use. So kind of at the beginning of a project, there's often not a lot of insights, right, into kind of what users are doing other than from what you can hear from your clients. So I always try to first take a look at web analytics. What are the kind of major behaviors that you see, just to understand kind of what tasks are being kind of driving the website right now. And then you can often map that against, for example, the top tasks that your client imagines users do on the website. And I usually do that because web analytics, it's often quite accessible. People have it running. In a lot of cases, they don't really use it. But at least they have it running because they can say they have web analytics. The second thing I usually work on is kind of in this behavioral part. So a usability test. And at the end of the day, this is just going to a user and having him or her carry out a few tasks on the website to just see what that experience is like. And for the last few years, I've been doing a lot more kind of remote usability studies. So a lot more just straight up talking to people over the phone or over Skype or whatever, simply because that's also a much more accessible method than getting someone to come to your company or going to them. And then the last one, kind of more attitudinal part, more qualitative, is contextual interviews. So this first project that I talked about, where we actually visited people at their homes, and we often spent, like, say, a morning or so, kind of going with them through their normal days, especially when you're working on a product which is like for professionals. Then just seeing them work is already quite fascinating and interesting to see how that aligns with the project or the website that you're working on. And then to focus in a little bit more on these quantitative tools, because I'm quite excited about these. These are like the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, loads of tools kind of came about. And these are all tools you can generally employ quite quickly. We use, I think, almost all of these for various reasons. 3Jack, which is in the top left, is something we use to test kind of different navigation structures. So it allows you to see the path that people take through navigation, and then to see where they make the detours, where they perhaps fail to find particular information in that information structure. We use Loop 11 to test kind of the workflow, so the journey throughout a product, and this is particularly interesting in when you have a very specific workflow, like a checkout process in your e-commerce site. And then we also use usabilitytesting.com, and this is kind of for unmoderated usability tests, so where you're not actively there, but they just kind of get the tasks and they get the questions from a system. And usability.com is mostly interesting to kind of scale up. So we work, for example, with clients where they're asking for 50 usability tests across multiple countries. And that's a little bit crazy, but that's something that is quite useful for if you want to especially test in other countries and you don't have access to those people yourself. So once we've kind of chosen the method, and I've shown a few, we always try to explain what a method can and can't bring. So this is an important part of, I think, the process of explaining why you took this approach, because it takes away those questions, especially at the end. Like, why didn't you just use a survey? It's much less expensive. I can do that in SurveyMonkey. So it explains to them why that method couldn't actually bring what they were trying to answer. But it also helps you to kind of scope your research and focuses in on the questions that you can already answer with the method, and can quickly show you what the next step is in terms of research. And then once you've chosen your method, you're going to talk obviously about the thing that you're testing. I think this highly depends, I guess, on what kind of project you're working on, when it's at the early stages or it's already fully developed. One thing that we've learned is that when you're testing, say, the real thing, it's very different from testing like a sketch. So I guess there's all kinds of fidelities that your prototype could be in. And what we found is that you either have high fidelity, which is like your HTML prototype, your full real thing, and then really at the bottom is low fidelity. So this is sketches, paper prototypes, and users have a real difficulty between distinguishing between a kind of a product or a project that is kind of half finished, where it's like the beta version, and it's fully finished, like all the features are there. So trying to kind of make your real HTML prototype look like a sketch doesn't really work. Users just will continue to see it as a website. They'll just complain that it looks really bad. So that's kind of that fidelity difference that you see, and that you have to take into account. If you really want to test just the concept and not any of the visual or the structure, you have to go for really low fidelity to make sure to get that kind of feedback. So you've chosen your method, you've chosen the product that you're testing, then all you have to do is test it with your stakeholders. Just try to ask them to kind of prove it. So to have them run through the survey or have them carry out the task that you set up. And what this does is first of all, it gets them into the process. But second of all, it gets them to see actually all of the problems that you might run into and things that you could potentially already fix before getting into it. And again, it takes away this discussion that you could have at the end, where you could say, the product wasn't just quite ready enough, even though you had to test at that time. So it kind of shares that responsibility. So obviously we have to do the session, and this is a photo from the usability testing that we did just last week. And so I won't go too much deeper into actually doing a session. I think there's a lot of online resources for that. But I'll talk about actually once you've done your kind of interviews with users, you've talked to your users, or you've done your survey. How do you then actually make sure that those results are kind of owned by the whole team and not just you? So the goal there, right, is building this kind of shared understanding of what the user needs are and how this kind of aligns with what you're building, and that this is kind of a team effort to do that. That you're kind of all in there to make it better. And what's typical, I guess, for a lot of these kind of user research activities is that you get this report. You say, this is what your users' needs are, and there you go. And I think most people don't really need that. It's a nice way to kind of stump the discussions and say, bam, we know we have this information, we're just going to do it. I think what's really important is to be a part of that kind of development process, where all of the results kind of quickly go into wherever the action is happening. So a trick that I use is kind of asking the client how the results will eventually be integrated into their process. So where will it end up? Now that I've made this for you, will it just be an email that's sent around to everyone? Because then I'll just write you a really good email. Or are these going to be tickets that are going into the backlog that they have? And I think especially with these kind of, a lot of the agile teams that we work with, that's the most typical thing. But it really depends, I guess, on who you're trying to involve. So there's various things that we can do. So you can have your backlog stories. What we also do is workshops. So, for example, for the client that I was talking about at the beginning, what we actually did is we had like a morning workshop where basically, they attended quite a few of the interviews we had, and we just asked them, what did you see? What from the notes you can make, what kind of post-its can you come up with? And then you generally have like 200 post-its or so of all kinds of ideas and things that people saw. You try to cluster that, and you kind of try to make this analysis of what you found a collaborative activity. And that's often just as useful as doing the reporting itself. You could also have like a brief report, so like a 1 or 2 slide decks of information about the process that it took, and basically the most important things that people should know. And the brief report is actually something we usually do kind of on the side. As it's something that often is sent throughout the company. So, we talk to users, we find all of these interesting things, and then they just want kind of the bulk summary of that engagement. Another thing is concept models, which I'll talk about a little bit more, but this basically the idea is that you kind of abstract what you found into kind of an understanding. So, the last month or so, I was working on a project where we had, I think, 3 agile teams. They were all working on this website. So this was a kind of operational website already running for quite a while. And they had 3 teams working on it on the same time. And what we did is we introduced a way for capturing the kind of user insights from the user research that we did. And we did interviews, and we did a survey. And what we did is we actually just wrote down the problem that we saw. Or the opportunity, I guess, that we saw. And we didn't actually write down the solution. I think in a lot of cases it's very common to just straight jump to the solution. But we actually thought about, let's first have the problem there, and actually the whole agile team could just come up with the solutions to that. So we thought that was kind of their role and not our role in this process. So we allowed them to just connect basically the findings that we found by placing it into their backlog, and they could just connect the solutions, the stories, or often multiple stories. So I think in terminology cases, a lot of the findings that we have were kind of epics, because they often were kind of more overhauling. And then at the last part is when we define this problem, we always share how to kind of evaluate it. So what does it actually mean to solve this problem? And quite often it means kind of going back to users and validating that what we found, the problem that we found, and then what we thought would basically ensure that the problem is solved, where it's actually solved. So that measure of success gives people kind of a reason or an aim to kind of shape their story. So, we try to pick deliverables that are engaging and in some way can kind of live within the project long after I'm gone, and perhaps even that agile team is gone. So we pick deliverables that can live, and we pick deliverables that can tell kind of the whole story, not just this kind of feature that was missing or usability problem that we saw. So there's a lot of different kind of deliverables that you can have that kind of tell this story from a longer time. So journey maps can do that. Workshops, especially workshops given by the internal stakeholder, can do that. But just posters or leaflets or even videos are some of those deliverables that can tend to kind of stay around in organizations. Then in larger projects, like having a blog where you continuously post down the results of talking to the users, getting kind of new insights and trying to kind of collect all of the different activities that are going on around kind of these users. And then the other part is prototypes. When you actually have an idea, to actually translate that into a workable thing. But I think whatever your deliverable is, I always try to use this kind of pyramid principle. So to talk about kind of the holistic, the overall experience problems at the top, and then to kind of deduce down from that into the details. Because it's really easy, right, to get stuck on that issue about the font being serif or sans serif, when you have a holistic problem that's about your product not matching the user needs. So it's kind of telling that story in a more easy way, I guess. I will try to be as honest as possible about the results, and in some cases brutally honest about the results. I think especially if you're close to the Agile team, you're sometimes kind of tempted to kind of say it a little bit more nicer, but it doesn't actually help them in the end, right? In the end, being brutally honest helps them by just giving it what it is and having them come up with solutions that might not completely solve it, but at least there's this awareness that it's a big problem rather than a small problem. And I think there's a great talk by Mike Montero. He gave a session at IXDA about this process, about kind of your role in a project. And then I want to talk a little bit about impact. So kind of the strategy you can employ to ensure that your project has a lot of impact. So when it comes to guerrilla research, I think there's 3 things that are particularly applicable to really doing kind of guerrilla user research. So as opposed to the kind of more formal ways of doing it. So there's being timely, so being really integrated with whatever process the client has. So being timely also means you don't have to be as rigorous in your setup. You don't have to have like a long script or a long, really robust survey method. It's all about just doing it whenever it's needed. And it also tends to be cheaper, simply because you don't try to be as rigorous. So you do a lot more just ad hoc things, which just basically cuts down the amount of time you spend on preparing stuff. This also means that you do it with, for example, you do your survey with less users than you might do in a real formal setting. Same with usability testing. 1 user is already a little bit more than 0, so that's kind of okay. And then the last part, which I think is, in the end, really the benefit of doing guerrilla user research, is that because you're trying to be kind of scruffy and trying to pull it all together at the last minute, you have to be inclusive. So you have to get your client to be part of the recruitment process. You have to be getting your developments to be part of figuring out whether the prototype is ready or not. So it's really, the fact that you have to do this all ad hoc makes it that you're trying to be more inclusive. But I have some ideas about that later. So what does it mean to be timely? I think a fundamental part is and this is kind of from the lean UX, I guess, methods, is to do this process faster, right? To build something, to measure it, and to learn it. Rather than doing that over months of time, to just do that in 2 or 3 weeks. To just build something, throw it out there, and try to learn whether it works or doesn't work. And this really is all about reducing, I guess, the time it takes to make something that people maybe don't need, or the time it takes to find out that people can't use it. So it's all about reducing that cycle. So if you look at a typical project of about, say, 5 or 6 sprints, we kind of sit down with the Agile team throughout the process. So I don't really believe that user research is something that can be disconnected from the Agile process, because basically by sitting with the Agile team, what I find is that a lot of those conversations that happen about user needs and how the project aligns with that happens within that same space. And being kind of disconnected from that, which is what a lot of kind of traditional user research firms do, is actually not really that helpful, because basically, at some point you become this point of like understanding for what the user feedback is. So you become this point of user insight that they can continuously refer to in the process to give them, to basically be, kind of that person that just tells what the user was saying, and to be that kind of person. But it also makes you the touch point for a lot of questions that pop up throughout the process. That might not be very formal questions. It's not a true research question, but it's just something that pops up throughout the process. And then you can be that touch point for whenever that happens. So, if you take this typical approach of 5 or 6 weeks, what we do, and there's, I think, different methods for doing this, but what we do is mostly to test kind of at the last 2 or 3 days, mostly 2 days of the sprint. So on the Thursday and the Friday of the second week of the sprint, we evaluate basically what they've built, and we explore ideas or understanding that they need for the scope of the next sprint. And I think this is kind of the critical part. I think it's very important to both evaluate what they've built, which is obviously something they can then improve upon, but to also explore ideas that they might have for the next sprint, and kind of get that understanding of what is maybe needed, if there are different user needs for that feature that they're just going to build the next sprint. And this kind of depends on how the Agile team is also structured. I think in a lot of kind of larger companies, it's very common to have, for example, designers be like 1 sprint ahead of development. They're still obviously connected with the current sprint, but they're ahead in terms of exploring new ideas that they have to build. So the idea here is that you can ensure that they're delivering on business value by evaluating what they're building right now, and that you're giving sprint support by exploring and understanding what they have to build for the next sprint. And then, depending on how many kind of sprints a project takes, and you could do this cycle basically for 20 sprints. After a couple sprints, say 2 or 3, we always try to do this kind of larger evaluation, which is a little bit different from the individual tests, as it kind of tries to focus on the whole experience rather than the kind of part that you're building in that particular sprint. And we do this because, especially I think working with Agile teams and working closely with development teams, it's really easy to get sucked into the details and to continue to improve and make that really better. I really care about details, and I like designing them, I like researching on them. But they're not necessarily going to create the most business value if you keep focusing on that for 20 sprints. So after 2 or 3 sprints, we do kind of a larger evaluation across the user experience. And this method, it's quite common in Lean UX, which might be a little bit of a harder sell, I guess, to companies. What is the commonly referred to name, I guess, in a kind of more enterprise environment is I think rapid iterative testing and evaluation, right? I guess in short. So that's how they tend to use it. So this large evaluation. So the reason is to do this, right? Is to make sure that you're not just building a functional product, but that the user experience is actually across all of the different parts of the UX spectrum, so that you actually deliver value and not just functional use. And doing this kind of larger evaluation allows you to actually evaluate across this spectrum. So I talked a little bit about this being timely. Then when it comes to being cheap, this is important. So I think one of the things that you kind of run into when you want to do any user research is this kind of burden of how do I get in contact with the people that this website is being built for. And typically in projects, this is really an expensive part, right? I think that in America, I think the average for recruiting, say, one user for a user test is around like $140 or so. In the Netherlands where I work, it's about the same, I think. So it's quite costly. So I think a lot of guerrilla user research techniques, basically they try to recruit people from their own networks. What we do quite often is to just recruit from social networks. So if we know kind of, for example, what online groups their customers are in, we try to go to that group and try to recruit from that group. Similarly, we just try to look up on social networks, do like a Twitter broadcast and see if we can find the right people to sign up. And then, if that's not possible, you try to do your friends or your colleagues and try to go through their networks to find the people that you're looking for. To be honest, that can only scale so far. I think I've kind of tired out my friends pool on doing those user tests. That's something to take into account. When you're trying to get budget for this, I think with your clients, which is sometimes a little bit hard, and it's sometimes really easy to make that step to like, I'll just do the recruiting myself. I think it's always good to take into mind the actually cost and benefit of doing that. Sometimes it's actually cheaper to just have a recruitment firm do it than you spending all of those hours in trying to find people, because recruiting people is definitely kind of a skill. It's something that recruitment firms have really perfected and have a significantly larger pool than you usually do. But this really depends on how many times you're testing. Quite often, if you only have to do like one test or one interview, kind of round of 4 or 5 users, then generally you're fine. But if you have to do that a lot of times, then it's a little bit harder. And I guess when all of this doesn't work, there's always just going to the street and asking people to join. We actually did this. We were working for one of the municipalities in the Netherlands, and basically their audience was all around us. All we had to do is walk to the grocery store and ask people to come and join. And for a lot of usability tests, you don't really need much more than 2 computers. And if you're doing an interview, maybe all you need is a notepad and maybe your phone for recording. I've done, in the last year, I think about 200 or so interviews just using my computer, where someone we would recruit would just be online, and we'd just have them, Skype in, Hangout in, WebEx in, whatever was most convenient for them. They could just do, and I'll be just sitting there and just using my own computer. And in a lot of cases, I used Silverback for recording, which is, I think, kind of a guerrilla usability testing tool. And they just released a new version, which actually works again, so that's good. So the other part is about being inclusive. So having an impact for a large part is dependent on how inclusive you can be and how much you can attract all of the different important stakeholders to be a part of this process. So a key part of that, and in open source this is a much more of a common practice, I think, than in in a lot of other projects, is to actually share everything that you do. So as you're writing your scripts, like whether that's your survey questionnaires or your interview script or your usability test script, to share that with the clients and the developers and all of the stakeholders, to share the people that you're testing with, to allow them to join the sessions, especially when you're doing guerrilla user research. You don't have this formal lab around you with all of these facilities to do things. So just having like a WebEx or something, sometimes even Google Hangouts works just fine there. Just something so that people can join. And often just having this option to join is already enough for people to say that they've been included in the process. And then I think a lot of the people that do care, they will actually, they will join a session and they will watch. And then obviously the analysis part is a little bit more tricky, but that's also something where I try to be kind of open. If I have a spreadsheet or something like that, that's always shared amongst the group, and that they can add their own issues, that I will try to categorize those. And that the report might just be a conversation that we have around the findings, rather than an actual PDF that they can read. So an example, I guess, that I want to include is the ones that we did for the usability test of last week. We did this all in a Google spreadsheet. Where basically not all the people in the room could participate, and some of them actually even did it remotely. And so those are kind of common practices that you can do to be inclusive. But being inclusive is also, I think, about including kind of the right people in the process. So it's often quite easy, right? The project team that you're working with directly, they will give you kind of the information that you need to at least get started. But a big part is finding the people that are actually most affected by the bad user experience, right? That this product or website that you're offering on is affecting. So what you can see is, a good example is, I guess, support. Support often has to explain all of these like really inexplicable user interfaces or problems that people encounter on the website. They don't have to explain it once. No, they have to explain it like 10 or 20 or dozens of times. And they know the perfect way to answer that, but they also know what the solution could be. So connecting with them is worthwhile. And a project that I worked on, I think, at the beginning of last year, we were working for kind of a large telecom, and we had to investigate how the support channels that they offered on their website, how well they were doing, and why people were going to certain channel, as we wanted to divert them obviously to the channels that were less expensive. So one of the things, for example, I think chat is about 50 to 80% cheaper than having someone call in, and then email is even much more cheaper than having someone call in. So there's a lot of these channels, right, that people feel more comfortable with, and they just go to call. So while we were working on this team, we found that the product team really had no good understanding of what the users were looking for, what answers they were trying to get. And what we did is we just asked, for example, support. We asked sales, like, what are the top 10 questions that you're getting? And what are the answers that your help desk provides? And that we saw that actually, like, all of that kind of completely aligned. Sales and support both saw the same questions. And that meant that within the interface, we could direct people to certain support channels, where we could say, like, if you have such a question, actually your answer is best served if you just chat, because you just need to type down a whole bunch of information. So this got us to understand basically also what was kind of needed from those different support channels that we didn't actually know. So one of the things that we found out with, for example, using a chatbot, that people are really concerned that it might just be a bot and not a real person. And they will do that Turing task quite quickly. They will really figure out that it's a bot within a second. And what we found is that because there are actually real people behind that, for this telecom at least, we found that giving the username or giving the user the name of the representative that they were talking to, starting with an actual like line that a person would say, and not like a kind of representative kind of support line question. So that first interaction was really important, and then people were actually okay with using chat. So it's I guess about finding the people that are hurting and involving them in the process of shaping the user research, shaping the design that you're doing. So one way to have an impact is to talk to the people that are actually hurting, which is quite often the business. They're quite often hurting because they see competitors gaining much more market. So it's about trying to figure out what is this kind of monetary impact of the things that I'm doing, of the designs that I put out. So it's trying to strike that balance between how much user value does it actually create, and how much business costs are related to that. So kind of trying to take that role. So one example that I have for that is trying to figure out that impact. Is a few months ago I worked on this project where, for example, we had an app that had undergone a lot of rigorous testing. I think we did like 4 rounds of user testing on that, a lot more than we usually do. And what we saw is that, it worked quite well actually. But when people would switch to landscape mode, which would happen only once in a while in that test, they would go like, oh, this is really bad. It really didn't work that well. And we spent quite a lot of time with the client, like figuring out, like actually being able to support that required them to really adjust their user interface, to really think about a lot of different things and to change it quite radically. And this was like 2 years ago, so landscape wasn't as well supported as it is now in most apps. And what we actually did is in the last user research round, we actually talked to users like how typical is it that you would use this in landscape mode? Like what are the times that you would use this? And we looked at their qualitative or quantitative data as to how often was this actually happening. And what we found is that people really didn't want it because the orientation in which they were using it was kind of a bike thing, so it was much more often like this. And in the quantitative data, we also didn't see that kind of trigger quite often. So what we did is we actually found out that although there's probably some benefit to doing it, especially going forward, but at this point in time, the cost benefit would probably much more favor really improving that portrait interface, which had a lot of troubles, than to allocate that budget to making a good portrait mode. And what you see is that, so this is, I guess, a really old Motorola phone. I don't even remember it anymore. That a lot of features that you say are kind of delightful now, or were delightful back then, aren't really delightful anymore. So like Motorola, like when they don't advertise as much anymore with phones, but if they do, they don't advertise that you don't have to carry around this kind of bulky battery anymore, right? That's not the point anymore. That's not a delightful feature. At the time, having that as your marketing point, that was a really delightful feature. So we try to explain to clients like what is this difference between features that create a lot of value and features that are kind of basics and things that just always have to be there. So we use the Kano model for this. This is from Naoki Kano in the 80s to explain to clients why their product is creating a great user experience or why it's not. So there's, I guess, the degree of achievement, how well a feature is executed, and then the satisfaction that people have with that particular part. So there's kind of basic attributes. So these are attributes that the product needs to have anyways. Like no matter what you're doing, you have to be able to log in, or you have to be able to create something. So kind of basic features. A good example, I guess, of that would be that in Drupal 8, we now have a WYSIWYG in there. For a lot of people that think about content management systems, having a WYSIWYG is a basic feature. Just like, I guess, toilet bowls in your hotel rooms. It's kind of a basic feature. You kind of expect that to be there. And then we have performance attributes, where you could say more of it is better. And this isn't the case as much anymore as it used to be in the past, but for example, having more gigabytes in your Dropbox or whatever would just be better. More of it is better. And then you have attractive attributes, where you could say these are really differentiating. And I think for a short amount of time, like having internet on the airplane was a truly differentiating attribute of their product offering. Now it's becoming more and more, I guess, between performance and a basic attribute, at least here in the US. So what we often find is that we kind of live in this feature-driven world, and there's kind of an extreme focus on delivering delightful features, in some cases kind of gimmick features, and they quite often forget about what are the basic features that my product should deliver. Because kind of this set of features isn't thought about as a dynamic set of features where there's different attributions to each feature rather than like a 0-1 kind of decision. So I guess to quote, it's not enough that we build products that function, that are understandable and usable. We also need to build products that bring joy, excitement, pleasure, and fun. So to recap, hypothesis first. Choose the right method, trying to find a deliverable that's engaging, and then try all kinds of tricks to make sure that whatever you do manage to sell in terms of UX research has an impact. All right, thank you. Are there any questions? Sure, go ahead.
What do you typically use for your prototyping tool? Do you do CSS and HTML? Do you use tools like Axure? Do you use a variety of things?
That's a very good question. So it depends, I guess, on the hypothesis. So if the hypothesis requires there to be a real thing, then we go for HTML prototyping, for example, doing it as quickly as possible. And whenever we have to tie data into it really quickly, we often go for like Axure. Where especially in a new version, it's a lot easier to just quickly get information into it. And if we only have to test, say, like the concept or the workflow, all we do is to have the screenshots and then use, for example, InVision to just make quick kind of click-throughs through the product. So it kind of depends, I guess, on what you need to answer the question that you have. But either Axure, InVision, or actually building the thing. Yeah. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the biggest challenges I've had is clients who insist on upfront design rather than iterative while building. We don't want the design team working in parallel with developers. They want the traditional design everything, sign off on it, and go build it. How do you push back against that effectively to say we have to be building and designing in parallel so we can do both of those iteratively effectively?
Right. So I guess So there's two parts to that. The first part is, I guess, is that do they actually know that what they build up front, whether that will deliver the value that you're expecting? So to what extent can they validate basically what that thing that they're going to then build up front or design up front, that will give up the value that they need? Usually there's a huge disconnect there. And the second part is also asking them, I guess also a question that goes against yourself a little bit, like what was the time that you actually had that design that you made be completely the same at the end of the process? That's rare. And that's rare because you learn a lot throughout that process that tries to make it better. So I think that's usually the argument that I use, is that actually being part of that process makes it even more better. And you don't ever get the same value by doing it one at a time. Because actually learning about what your users needs is an iterative process. It's not something that you can just do one user research and go like, okay, I found out everything that there needs to be known, and I can just go ahead and do it.
One of the biggest challenges I have is I had one client who did a year's worth of iterative user research,
right,
and then hired a development company to build it.
That's terrible.
And that was our response because we were that development company.
Yeah. So there's a lot of disconnect there, usually between what's possible to build and what user research comes up with, and especially design activities. We can definitely go blue sky quite quickly, and then there's a big disconnect with what can actually be built. So a lot of that is also integrating to make sure that you're actually delivering on value throughout the process, rather than only having that validation either at the end, or figuring out that the value that you anticipated is in no way connected with what you're actually doing at the end. So it's trying to bridge that gap, I guess.
That's always been a challenge.
Yeah, it is. But it's a hard sell. One of the things that we do is we try to combine kind of design activity and UX research activity kind of into one role, as that's generally more acceptable within an agile team. If it is possible we try to split it up, but that's only possible when you actually have usually multiple agile teams working on
it. On one slide, you said that you test at the last 2 or the last day of every sprint. Now, in a situation where the sprint is quite full and you have stories that are complete by the time you get to testing, when do those get tested, or do they fall through the gaps?
So when they get complete on Friday?
Let's say they are complete by the end of Friday, or they have just completed. They weren't ready for testing.
Yeah, then you just test them in the next
You just
round.
do it at the end of the next sprint?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, generally there is just a cutoff point. So what we try to do is, instead of doing like full days of testing, to just do like Friday morning testing, and then to schedule one participant, say like at the end of the day, and sometimes even on Monday morning, like one more participant. And then what that allows you to do is that if you see like tiny things that really screwed up,
the user experience to be able to still fix that, or to bring in a feature that you might have not just about finished in time. A lot of that is doing agile user research, trying to space out your participants a little bit more so that you just have more room to try out kind of ad hoc approaches. All right. Other questions? No? All right. Thank you.